PFAS litigation expands as federal rules take effect. When we first examined the surge in PFAS litigation in early 2025, much of the legal activity centered on contamination claims, consumer lawsuits, and state level enforcement. 1 year later, the landscape has shifted. What began as a wave of litigation is now intersecting directly with federal compliance deadlines, Superfund liability expansion, and accelerating state product bans. The question is no longer whether PFAS exposure carries legal risk. It is how regulatory implementation and expanded liability frameworks are reshaping compliance, remediation, and operational planning in 2026. The legal landscape surrounding per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, has entered a new phase in 2026. While 2024 and 2025 were marked by high-profile lawsuits targeting manufacturers and product brands, this year is defined by regulatory implementation and expanding liability exposure. As federal drinking water standards move into compliance phases and Superfund designation broadens responsibility beyond chemical producers, PFAS risk is increasingly intersecting with operational, environmental, and financial planning. Federal drinking water standards enter implementation. In 2024, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, finalized the first nationwide drinking water standards for several PFAS compounds under the Safe Drinking Water Act. In 2026, those standards are no longer theoretical. Utilities are conducting required monitoring, assessing treatment needs, and preparing capital investment strategies to meet enforceable maximum contaminant levels. Public notification obligations and compliance timelines are now active considerations for municipal systems across the country. The implementation phase is reshaping litigation dynamics. Exceedances tied to federally enforceable standards may strengthen claims related to contamination, remediation costs, and public health impacts. For utilities and upstream industrial dischargers, regulatory benchmarks now provide clearer reference points in legal proceedings. Superfund designation broadens liability exposure. Another structural shift comes from the designation of PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA. The designation expands potential liability beyond manufacturers to include site owners, operators, transporters, and entities deemed potentially responsible parties. In practice, this has led to increased environmental due diligence in mergers and acquisitions, heightened scrutiny of historical site operations, emerging contribution claims among co-defendants, insurance coverage disputes over PFAS-related cleanup. The Superfund framework introduces long-tail exposure that extends beyond product litigation and into property transactions, remediation planning, and legacy site assessments. State product bans and reporting requirements. Accelerate Minnesota's broad PFAS phase-out law was among the most visible state-level actions in 2025. Since then, additional states have advanced product restrictions and reporting requirements covering categories such as textiles, cookware, cosmetics, food packaging, and juvenile products. For manufacturers and retailers, the challenge is increasingly operational rather than purely legal. Companies must track PFAS use across complex supply chains, respond to reporting databases, and adjust formulations in response to patchwork state requirements. This evolving compliance environment has also triggered industry-led legal challenges seeking to clarify preemption, product safety standards, and regulatory scope. Consumer and disclosure claims continue to rise. Beyond contamination cases, litigation tied to marketing and disclosure practices remains active. Lawsuits against consumer brands have alleged misleading, non-toxic, or environmentally friendly claims where PFAS were present in products. These cases reflect a broader shift in litigation strategy. Plaintiffs are increasingly leveraging consumer protection statutes and transparency expectations rather than relying solely on environmental contamination claims. For companies making sustainability-related assertions, product chemistry scrutiny is intensifying. Military contamination and federal cleanup pressures persist. PFAS contamination linked to firefighting foam used at military installations continues to generate legal and financial pressure. More than 24 states have pursued claims seeking remediation support, and cleanup obligations remain a long-term federal budget consideration. Settlements involving fire protection manufacturers and related entities have demonstrated the scale of potential financial exposure tied to aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF contamination. What to watch in 2026? Several developments are likely to shape PFAS litigation and compliance trajectories in the coming year. Utility treatment funding allocations and rate impacts, contribution claims among potentially responsible parties, state-level expansion of intentional use bans, insurance coverage determinations related to remediation costs, ESG and product transparency scrutiny intersecting with PFAS disclosures. PFAS litigation is no longer confined to chemical manufacturers. As regulatory enforcement matures, liability considerations are increasingly embedded in operational planning, environmental management, and transaction strategy. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.